Hey guys, welcome back to That Florida Feeling. How are you guys doing this week? You good? I hope you're good. Did everybody I can't really say enjoy, but learn something new about serial killers in Florida? There's a lot of them. It's a lot more than I thought. Well, we're going to move on from the dark episodes. This is another kind of spooky one, but it's definitely not dark. There's no warnings. But first of all, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow, or whatever you do to make sure that you don't miss any future episodes, especially next week's when we get ready for Halloween and we talk about Haunted St. Augustine. Now, this week we're going to talk about the odd and the creepy Florida. I wanted to talk about interesting places, the weird, the odd, the creepy, places that Florida calls home or have interesting backstories. Some you've probably heard of, some you've not. Florida is definitely full of the odd, unique, and creepy locations that come from having such a diverse history. Florida is definitely a melting pot with people from many different countries, Native Americans, and many different countries having laid claim to it at first makes it not surprising that among Florida's bright and sunny shores and palm trees lay dark secrets, odd places, and some places that fit a little bit of both. Actually, some places that they just want you to forget about. Now, the first odd place I'm going to talk about is probably one that you've heard of. Hopefully you've heard of it. It's called the Coral Castle. If you haven't heard of it, we're going to talk about it now. And it sits in Miami-Dade County between Homestead and Leisure City. The Coral Castle is actually both odd and a little creepy. It's also at the center of lots of speculation because of how it was built. The Coral Castle is made up of numerous megalithic stones that are mostly made of limestone and coral that weigh tons. And the part that really bothers people is that it wasn't that it's made of limestone and coral, but it was more of how it was made. The castle was made by Edward Ledskilinen, and we're going to call him Ed or Edward from now on. Edward was from Latvia, and he came to the U.S. after being rejected by his fiancée just the day before their wedding. Talk about bad timing. And he came to the U.S. in hopes of starting over. Now, he came here, and unfortunately he developed tuberculosis, but he was magically healed, and he claimed that he was healed by magnets. Nobody ever proved it. Nobody really even knew how or why, but he was just miraculously healed one day, and he attributed it to magnets. Maybe he knew something we didn't. But Edward started to build the Coral Castle, and it actually took him 28 years to build. And the weird part is that he built him by himself. He wouldn't let anybody even see him working. He was said to have built part of it at night just so people wouldn't watch. Now, a few teenagers did try to spy on him, and they claimed that he was moving large rocks just like they were balloons. So they asked him again how he was doing it, and he would only tell them something about perpetual motion holder. Of course, nobody really knew what that meant. And they just let him go along his business. Now, he built this place, and he named it Ed's Palace, and it was in Florida City, Florida. And he started to build it in 1923 after purchasing land from Reuben Moser. Now, Florida City actually borders the Everglades, and it was really remote at that time, even though it's still a little remote today. And he felt that this was going to be the perfect place to build his castle with his peace and quiet. And the castle actually stayed in Florida City until he wanted to move it. And he decided to move it in 1936. Now, I told you it took 28 years, and you're like, that's not 28 years. Well, no, but just hold on. He wanted to move to Florida, or he stayed in Florida City, and he decided he was done in Florida City. He wanted to move. So in 1936, he decided to move, and not only decided to move, he wanted to take the castle and all of it with him. So he did. And he moved it north towards Miami, where it sits now at 28655 South Dixie Highway in Miami, Florida. And of course, that's unincorporated, but it is closest to Leisure City. Now, Edward chose this final location because, again, of the remote location, and he wanted some privacy. He actually spent a total of 3 years moving the castle north only 10 miles to get it to its current location. Now, when he got to the new location, he thought it needed a new name, and he named it Rockgate. And this is because he placed a huge rear swinging gate that sits at the back wall around the castle. And Edward worked on this castle and built this castle, and he continued to up until 1951 when he died. Now, the coral pieces are actually the newer part of the castle. They did not come from the original location. And the coral pieces that you see today were actually quarried from pieces on the property right outside the walls of where it sits today. The property where it is today had 4 quarries But the east and the west have since been filled in, so you can still see the north and the south ones. Now, Edward would always let people visit the property, even when it was in Florida City, and he would only charge them 10 cents. But after moving between Homestead and Leisure City, he decided he needed to charge them a little more, and he would charge them 25 cents. But of course, being the nice man he was, he would still allow people to enter for free if they had no money to pay. Now, the sign at the front of the castle said to ring the bell twice, and he would come down to let people in. And of course, he would always get asked how he made the castle, and he would only tell people it's not difficult if you know how to do it. Of course, never actually elaborating on how he did it. He would also get asked why he built the castle, and he would often answer Sweet 16. Again, a vague answer, and most people actually did not know what that meant. A lot of them believed it was for his long-lost love that left him before the wedding. Now, Edward was doing fine, but he put a sign on the castle one day that alarmed people that he was going to go to the hospital. And he did. He went to the hospital in Miami, and he stayed there 28 days before he passed from a kidney infection. So once he passed, they knew that they needed to go back to the castle to see what was going on. So they went to his property, and they found $3,500 back in 1959. That's equivalent to almost $35,000 today. But he had no will, so the property went to his closest living relative, who was his nephew, Harry, who was living in Michigan at the time. Now, the story about the castle kind of gets a little iffy at that point. Nobody really quite knows how it changed from the nephew. Some say that it was sold by him. Some say a rich family took it from him. Some say that it was bought from the state of Florida because they didn't know that there was castle on the actual land. I guess when they forgot to pay taxes or somebody didn't pay taxes, Florida took it back and then they sold it, and whoever bought it without knowing what they actually had. But nobody really knows the true story. Either way, the new owners turned it into a tourist attraction and named it Rockgate Park. But eventually it was named the name we know today, the Coral Castle. And the castle was actually sold to the Coral Castle Incorporated, and that's the company that still owns it today. You can still visit it. The property is on the National Register of Historic Places. Now, the actual Coral Castle is a beautiful place. The castle consists of 1,100 short-ton stones that make up walls, carvings, furniture, and even a tower. And the tower's where he got to live. The castle is made of oolite limestone, which is often actually mistaken for coral. And oolite is fairly common in South Florida, and it's easy to access because it usually only sits under a few inches of topsoil. The stones were fastened together without mortar, and so much so that the actual weight of the rocks is what keeps them in place. The precision is so exact that the joints fit together so well that no light even passes through them. Now, the perimeter wall is more impressive because it's actually of uniform height and has never shifted or sank. The two-story castle tower was Edward's living quarters. There was also a sundial, a polar telescope, an obelisk, a barbecue, a water well, a fountain, stars and planets carved into things, and numerous pieces of various furniture. And the furniture is not just furniture, but it's super detailed furniture, and it includes a heart-shaped table, a table in the shape of Florida, some 25 rocking chairs, bathtub, a couple beds, and even a throne. Now, the gate that we talked about earlier is actually a 9-short-ton revolving 8-foot gate that sits on the property. And the gate was carved so well that it fit within a 1/4 inch of the walls. And it was so easily balanced at one time that a child could open it with their finger. The gate was actually one of the true mysteries of the castle because it was so balanced and because it worked so well. And it continued to work up until it stopped in 1986. And they had to remove it. But in order to remove it, they had to use 6 men in a crane, which of course we know that Edward didn't have or didn't use to our knowledge. The removal of the gate, though, actually allowed them to see how he balanced the gate. It's kind of unlocking the mystery. And of course, the gate was repaired, and it's still at the castle today, but everybody says it still doesn't move with the same ease of when he had it. The castle actually is a very popular tourist destination in South Florida, and that's because everybody has their own idea of how it's made, especially without the use of machines or help. And they have different ideas, from him levitating stones to aliens, or that he just lied and used help and nobody knew it. He paid people off. But everyone agrees that Edward definitely had complete knowledge of the laws of weights and leverage. And the castle still stands today. It's stood through time and hurricanes and changes, and it's often now referred to as Florida's Stonehenge. It's even popular in culture. It's had many movies shot at the castle, songs written about it, and there's been subject of numerous episodes on different TV programs and even podcasts talking about it. The Coral Castle is definitely on my bucket list to go see. I don't know if I really care why or how he made it, but I definitely want to see it because it just sounds like an impressive art, like it's a lost art almost. He definitely knew what he was doing, and I would love to see that one person's passion that still stands today. So if you're ever in South Florida, maybe look up the Coral Castle. So the next place I want to talk about is odd, creepy, and sits off the coast of Florida. No, I'm not talking about the Bermuda Triangle, although I'm sure I could. I'm actually talking about the Neptune Memorial Reef. And if you've never heard of it, don't feel bad. I had no idea what it was until this podcast. And now that I know about it, I'm actually very impressed. The reef is an underwater columbarium. Don't worry if that word sounds super weird to you. I'll explain it. It's actually a place or a structure for the respectful or public storage of funerary urns that hold the deceased. They were popular back in ancient Rome. The reef is the world's largest man-made reef, and it covers actually 600,000 square feet, and it sits at a depth of 40 feet. Now you're thinking, why would anybody do this? Well, the reef was actually created by Gary Levine and designed by artist Kim Brandel. And it was originally going to be called the Atlantis Reef, but we know it wasn't called that. And the project, funny enough, is still ongoing, and in fact, it'll continue to be ongoing. The reef was actually supposed to be a city to look like Atlantis. It's going to have underwater roads, and part of it does, and it wants to lead to a central feature that has benches and statuaries. Now, the reef actually sits 3.25 miles off the coast of Key Biscayne, and it allows people to be buried at sea. It can hold 850 remains it does hold 850 remains at this point, with plenty of room for plenty more. What is it, the Disney thing? There's always room for one more. And this place really holds that true. And the reef is actually referred to as an underwater cemetery or underwater mausoleum, but doesn't actually meet those criteria to be considered either of those. The cremated remains of the deceased are actually mixed with cement and form the features of the reef. So they're not just an urn sitting on the bottom of the ocean. They are part of the building structure of the reef itself. And of course, they put memorial plaques that are added to show, the loved ones who can dive there, who is there. And it's actually considered technically a cremation memorial site. And of course, the reef is the artistic representation of the lost city of Atlantis, as we talked about. But the cool thing is that these structures actually help promote coral growth and marine life in the area. So not only does it give people another way to be buried and remembered, but it also helps sustain nature. And that's really cool on its own. The man-made reef was actually opened in 2007, and of course they faced a lot of difficulties to get it there. The reef has been permitted by so many different associations such as NOAA, Florida Fish and Wildlife, EPA, and Army Corps of Engineers because they wanted the reef to be able to withstand a hurricane stronger than Hurricane Andrew. And it has, or it will, kind of both. The reef sits directly on the ocean floor and is designated as a home for sea life and divers. Birders and divers are welcome, but you can't fish or take lobster from the site. It's more of like a refuge for the marine life. And the site actually has done its job. It's brought in coral and marine life, and it did this in only the first 2 years it was open, so it's continued to flourish to this day. The site can be accessed by personal or charter boats. People can dive, snorkel, or just sit at the site. The reef is actively dived by many people, including the loved ones whose remains are remembered in the reef. Words, y'all. The reef wanted to create life after life. That's their motto. And you can actually visit their website to choose your spot at this final resting place. I went on there to see really what it was about, and it seems like a really interesting, awesome way to put someone into the afterlife. You can even have your pets placed in the reef. The reef allows people to have another way to spend their afterlife, allows people to learn about the world under the oceans. It allows people to get a different kind of visitation with their loved ones. And it allows people to see a beautifully constructed version of what they think Atlantis looks like. So it's definitely an interesting, odd, maybe slightly creepy part of Florida. But either way, it's definitely something that if you're a diver or a snorkeler, or if you've been thinking about how you want to go on to the next world, this is definitely something you should check out. Maybe I'll get to go one day while I still can see. It just sounds like an interesting place. The next place I want to talk about is spooky. And even spooky is in its name. And I'm talking about Spook Hill. If you've lived in Florida, you might have heard of Spook Hill. And Spook Hill is in Lake Wales, Florida. The hill is a legend because of how cars react on the hill. The legend is if you place the car in neutral, the car actually appears to roll uphill. And there's actually a legend of a couple of these different kind of places all over the U.S. This is Florida's very own. The hill was actually problematic even before cars because horses struggled to go up or down the hill, whichever way the hill supposedly goes. Now, you're probably asking, why is there a spooky hill? What's the legend? Well, the legend is that an Indian chief battled an alligator. That is very Floridian in its own. But an Indian chief battled an alligator that was terrorizing the local village. And the fight on the hill became so intense that both parties actually died on that hill. Now, nobody knows which one actually haunts the hill to this day, but that's what they attribute the odd happenings to when cars roll up or down, or horses don't want to go, or animals avoid the area. They attribute it to this fight that happened so many years ago. And the hill is actually on the National Register of Historic Places as recently as 2019. So if you're ever near Lake Wales, maybe you should go to Spook Hill. Maybe you should see how your car reacts to it. I think I kind of want to go. It's not far from where I'm living. So maybe one day I'll go out there and take a video, and we'll see what my car decides to do. Other than my car, it'll do the exact opposite. All right, moving on to more odd and creepy Florida. The next place I want to talk about is in Estero, Florida, which is southwest Florida, kind of near Naples. And it's the I'm not going to say that right, Koreshan State Historic Site. The Koreshan site was chosen by Cyrus Teed, the leader of the Koreshan Unity, because Estero, Florida was going to be the site of the New Jerusalem. Just imagine that. World is going to start over in South Florida. And I'm not making fun. It's Florida. The Unity actually started in 1870 when Teed began to practice and preach his beliefs. And of course, in doing so, he gained followers, and not just a couple, but actually a lot of followers. And he took them to Chicago, San Francisco, and finally in Estero, Florida, where the forum of New Jerusalem would take place. They established this in 1894. And the community actually grew. It didn't just stay at those followers. It grew and gained new people, and it even hit a peak from 1903 to 1908 with its highest amount of followers, and that was about 250 residents that lived at this site. Now, the actual belief itself had over 4,000 members around the country at one time. And Teed had brought them to Estero to establish a utopian community that would have 10 million streets that were 400 feet wide. Much bigger than Florida. Now, of course, the group continued to work, and they built beautiful buildings in this New Jerusalem and continued their utopian desires until the group declined after Teed's death in 1908. Now, you can actually still visit this utopia. It still sits in Estero today. A lot of buildings were already constructed for their new city. They were ready for this New Jerusalem. They even built a bakery, a printing house for their documents and pamphlets, a general store. They had concrete works for their masonry, a power plant that actually powered the surrounding area years before the rest of the area would even get power, and many more buildings. The site was also extensively landscaped. They wanted it to look immaculate. And they continued this up until the last follower living at the compound actually gave it over to the state of Florida in 1961. Now, the Koreshan State Historic Site was actually opened a couple years later in 1967. Now, the last remaining member that gave them this site actually was able to continue to live at the site until their death in 1981. Hedwig Mickle was the last member and was actually buried in the park. The park has two other Koreshan cemeteries nearby, but since they didn't believe in reincarnation, they don't have headstones, but she is the only one actually buried at the site. And it's a beautiful site. The historic site is so beautiful because it was so well preserved and so taken care of. The area actually contains pine flatwood habitats, and they even brought in many plants that were imported by them, such as the false monkey puzzle from Queensland, Australia, sausage trees from Africa, eucalyptus, mango, and other fruit-bearing trees that were not native to Florida. They also tended to like bamboo and many other flowering plants that came actually just a little bit north of them from the Edison and Ford Winters estate, which is also located in Southwest Florida. The park, though, was so quiet and so pristine that it actually became a wildlife haven as well. There's actually a sense of wildlife that you can still see in the park, such as the gopher tortoise, bobcats, gray foxes, North American river otters, and even alligators, which it's Florida, so there's going to be alligators. Bird watching is actually also popular in the park, as you can see bald eagles, swallow-tailed kites, and red-shouldered hawks. Now, the park also has lots of recreational activities such as canoeing, fishing, picnicking, camping, boating, hiking, wildlife viewing, and a couple other things. And you can definitely view and see these old buildings that have been well preserved. And the site does have amenities that include a boat ramp, campgrounds, trails, and a picnic area. It is a state park, so it is open year-round. It usually opens at 8 a.m. and closes around sunset. I chose not to include that on one of my state parks because I felt that that was just an odd, creepy, different kind of site for Florida. And I felt that it fit this more. I do want to go. It sounds like a beautiful place. I don't know. Compounds of old religions just kind of creep me out on their own. I don't know about you guys. Now, the next place I want to talk about is beautiful, kind of old, very creepy, and probably slightly haunted. So we are going to talk about some ghosts. And that's the Arcadia Opera House. And it's actually been investigated by many paranormal investigators. It's a 2-story, almost 9,000 square foot building that sits directly in downtown Arcadia. The building was built in 1905 after a fire tore through the downtown, and this is their reconstruction. The Opera House is actually a museum and an antique shop now, but that kind of only adds to its creepiness. The Opera House is still in use today, but for things like political events, graduations, dances, there was even silent movies at one time, and back during World War II, it was the USO headquarters. So the Opera House has definitely been put to good use, and definitely contains a lot of history. The main problem with this opera house is that nobody really knows why it's creepy or why it's haunted. People have heard large groups in the auditorium when no one's there, phantom footsteps, which seem to be a classic for hauntings, children laughing, which are creepy on their own, and plenty of other eerie noises that just seem to go with the building. Now, the creepiest thing seen here is there's a certain hallway that seems to be darker than dark and has a shadow figure moving down the sides. Children also tend to be the spookiest part of this opera house, as you can sometimes see a young girl in the corner of an upstairs window. I don't know about you guys, but anything that involves children, ghosts, I'm out. That's just, I don't know if it's insanely creepy or just insanely sad to me. So the Arcadia Opera House is a beautiful place and absolutely hauntingly so, but probably one I'm not going to ever visit. Maybe I'll drive by and see if I can see the little girl in the window, but that's probably going to be my extent for there. Now, the last place I want to talk about is odd, creepy, and a little bit of Florida's dark past. And it's the Sunland Hospital. Well, it's not really a hospital. It's actually a chain of hospitals. Sunland is now a defunct chain of mental health facilities. The hospitals were originally named W.T. Edwards Tuberculosis Hospitals, and they were opened in the 1950s. They were changed to Sunland Centers, specializing in mental health and disabilities for children. And the hospitals were actually shut down in 1983, or by 1983, due to health and safety reasons. And the hospitals had locations all over Florida, such as Tampa, Lantana, Mariana, Tallahassee, and Miami, and other various locations. I do know that there was one near Orlando at some point. In fact, I even think it was the headquarters. The hospitals were built the same way, with the main buildings being long and thin, 5 stories tall, some smaller wings branching off. And all the windows were multi-pane so that they could be opened with cranks, since the fresh air was thought to be the best for tuberculosis. In fact, the entire backside of each building was just a wall of windows for this treatment. The hospitals were useful up until antibiotics came to treat TB, and there was really no need for TB hospitals anymore because people were actually surviving it. So all the hospitals closed by the start of the 1960s, but since they were under jurisdiction of Florida Department of Health, they were shortly reopened as the Sunland hospitals. Of course, these were remodeled and used as mental health hospitals. Again, the main building, I believe, was in Orlando. And the centers did well. Treatment was adequate for patients at the time, but as you all know, problems always seem to arise. The centers became underfunded, understaffed, and of course, serious allegations would follow, especially for patient neglect. And you have to remember, a lot of these were children. The worst of the hospitals was said to be Sunland and Tallahassee. This is the most notorious of them. And it is said to have severe staffing shortages to the point where they couldn't even get things done. The building was also said to be falling in near the end. Now, the hospitals were mostly treating children, which meant they were set up with large pools, activities. Even the state mascot called Woodsy Owl would stop by. And the hospitals tended to try to work with, I lost the name of it, groups like Boy Scouts to let patients become scouts. They continued to do the best that they could, but continued to decline at the same time. And eventually they even were seen as cruel and subhuman because of how the treatments the patients were received. The hospitals thankfully came to an end in the late 1980s as children were sent to foster homes and group homes, realizing that these places were not good for them. Now, let's talk about Sunland Center in Tallahassee, because it does seem to be the worst, especially the oddest, creepiest, and just darkest in Florida's history. And they really started receiving residents first kind of in March of 1960s, probably around 1967. And the center was considered a hospital because it received patients that were both mentally and physically disabled, so they could handle both. But of course, the center was overcrowded within a year, and staffing and funding shortages began to follow. Of course, these shortages can cause a variety of problems such as bad food, overcrowding of the living spaces, inactivity of children that need to be active, unsanitary conditions, and unacceptable hygiene and dental practices. And of course, when these children, they were young children, so when they were growing up, they needed certain proper things so that they would continue to be able to grow and function and turn into adults. And they just weren't receiving this. In fact, it got so bad that they were called inhumane and torturous from certain people. It eventually got so bad that psychologists were even calling for the center to be shut down. And it finally was in 1983, after lack of funding, various scandals, and many other dark moments in their history. Now, of course, when they close a building, we all know that they don't just tear it down. They might want to reuse it. That's a thing in Florida. But thankfully they didn't. And the building actually stood as an eyesore for Tallahassee until it was demolished in 2006. But just because a building goes away doesn't mean it takes the bad energy with it. The grounds are still said to be haunted because of the horrible conditions patients lived and a lot of them died in. You can actually see relics from the hospital, a local museum in Tallahassee. And the spot where the building stood abandoned was actually a spot where ghost hunters and teens would go for scares. People even used to call it Sunnyland, and they would go in there as a rite of passage. The problem with Sunnyland was that it sat right outside of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement building, and so you had to go in the dead of night. Of course, when it's the most pitch black, no lights, and you had to sneak in. And it was creepy, not only because it was abandoned, but because it was just creepy. Of course, being abandoned, the trees, nature had reclaimed the land, and so you weren't just sneaking around a building, you were literally going through wildlife at the same time. Of course, the building was run down. There was a large sunken part that was just full of black, endless water. And, of course, homeless people flocked there because it was a safe spot for hiding. And, you know, could you imagine, like, I'm going to go explore this rundown building. And not only are you already nerves frayed because you're going through a pitch black building where anything could come out at you and you stumble upon homeless people, I would just, nope, I'd be gone. Of course, the building wasn't just creepy for all that, because it still had all the things in it. It still had child's paintings on the wall, the equipment still stood where they left it, and other things that could scare unsuspecting people at night while they were looking for the long-lost residents of Sunderland. Of course, if you Google this, you can find no shortage of scary stories from people who braved going to this hospital. Excuse me. One scary story talks about lights turning on and off with no electricity running to the building. A moaning sound coming from the basement where the morgue used to be. Sounds of kids playing. Oh, y'all know how I feel about children ghosts. Nope. Unfriendly feelings just from the building itself. Eerie screams that pierce the night. The sounds of shuffling and moving. And just generally a very bad desire to leave. Like something was telling you not to be there. You want to know what it is today? Like I said, today the building was demolished in 2006, but now it's home to an apartment complex. I kind of wonder if these people knew what once stood on these haunted grounds, or if they have problems to this day. I don't know. That just seems so creepy to me. Now that we've talked about some of the odd and creepy places in Florida, I guess you could visit them if you want, if you're into that kind of stuff. Some I might be interested in, some I might not be. But maybe you are. But say you're visiting a place at night, you're creeping around and your nerves are really, really high and you're just looking at this really unsettling place. You know who you do not want to run into? Florida Man. And today we're going to talk about a Florida man that you've probably heard of within the last week. This is not the original Florida Man story I wanted to share, but it is just too good not to share. Florida Man was arrested for trying to rob a Waffle House with finger guns. The story goes that the man, who was drunk and high, walked into a Waffle House with a small dog, pointed his hands into guns, and said, "This is a robbery," proceeded to steal napkins and run out of the Waffle House. Now you might ask, okay, drugs are a powerful thing. So the police get the phone call that someone tried to rob a Waffle House with finger guns. So they go hunt down this man, and they did find him. He was at home, still high and drunk, and he admitted to robbing the Waffle House of napkins. He was promptly arrested. Oh, Florida Man, how you entertain us daily. Please don't be that. Waffle House is a great place to go, especially drunk. But don't rob them. Enjoy the food, tip well, go home. So yeah, that was one, I did not plan on that one, but that one was just too good not to share. Oh gosh, I had to read that story like 3 times. I was just like, what? Well guys, did you enjoy that episode of some of the odd and creepy parts of Florida? I hope so. And I hope you guys are enjoying the spooky, scary, or just downright bad parts of Florida right now for the month of October. I will be finishing the month, like I said, with St. Augustine, the haunted St. Augustine episode. It is the most haunted city in Florida, and I figured that was fitting for next week's episode. If you guys do have any haunted stories from St. Augustine, send them to me. I would love to include them in the episode. I can't be the only one who's had some issues in that weird, hauntingly beautiful city. You can send them to me on Facebook, Instagram, or email me at thatfloridafeel@gmail.com. If you have any suggestions, comments, or anything you just want to say, even just to say hi, you can definitely email me or message me. I hope you guys have continued to enjoy this podcast as much as I've enjoyed doing it. Sorry, again, this was a shorter episode. I just wanted to do something odd and creepy. All right, guys, have a great week. Drink your water, wear your sunscreen, stay prepared for hurricanes. Even if it is still the end of hurricane season, it is still hurricane season. And of course, guys, that's your daily dose of sunshine.